Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, KRONAN, destined to bear the jewelled crown of Aquilonia on a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell you of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. And so it was that KRONAN, who now wore the jewelled crown of Aquilonia on a troubled brow, was grown mighty in the eyes of his people. For across Orkidom the call had gone out, as we have clearly identified before. But as the primal scream went out across the galaxy, each greenskin that heard it, well, more felt its power wash over them. Each threw back their heads and gave the same bellow, the clarion call of their people, the Waaagh. And it was mere days afterwards that the trickle began, a trickle that became a river that became a tsunami, as one after another starship began to arrive in the orbit of Aquilonia. But few were the lone ships that made the muster. Most often they were flotillas or minor fleets of ships, and KRONAN had become accustomed to the event of first contact. Now, in more effete or intellectually challenging settings, this might have involved lots of protocols, rules that could not be broken, prime directives and the like. But for KRONAN, first contact had been named thus for a very simple reason. For despite the power of the core, the centre of the Waaagh clearly being the cunning one himself, many of the bosses of the spacefaring piratical forces believed that they had a better shot at pulling off this war. And so it was that KRONAN would meet each and every one of them at the docking bay. One particular docking bay set aside for the purpose. The fleet bosses would disembark, start blathering on about how odd they were, and then this is when KRONAN made first contact. In most cases, it took but one swing before he contacted the neck of the boss, and then got his noggin-arranging grots, often led by Happy Len, to remove the new trophy and have it added to the stack behind him. Of course, this could not be random or slapdash, and required that the head be placed according to the amount and fightiness of the forces that he had brought to the gathering. And so it was that when each head was taken, it was oft the case that Happy Len would need to direct exactly where the new decoration should be placed. Needless to say, the grots were still orky, hence the discourses betwixt them would invariably devolve into a massed fray. Yet, surprisingly, Happy Len tended to win out every time and have his way. Okay, it might have something to do with the fact that Tiddles, KRONAN's pet squig, treated Happy Len like a pet of his own. So anyone disagreeing with Len tended to get a close encounter of the horrifically and terminal dental kind. Now some found it odd that KRONAN would throw tidbits of food to Tiddles, who would then engulf most of it in his mighty maw, yet always seemed to save some for the wee grot whenever he was present. Should Happy Len like it or not, the wagging squig watched him until he consumed the gift, no matter his own wishes. Hippocrates did not seem to mind his main aid being affectionately protected or bossed about by the huge squig, but then it didn't really matter what he thought. For to KRONAN, Tiddles could do no wrong, and if that was the case, then, well, he could do no wrong. So even when Tiddles borrowed someone's limb as a meal, sometimes even during a meeting, then it would behoove them to not grumble about it too much. But let us crack on. And so it was that the newer stairship commanders were far more compliant these days. It was probably the tree-like construction, with over 100 lovely green heads now festooned all over it, that gave them the hint that they did not really wish to indulge in the ritual of first contact. But of course, as orcs, there would always be some, and Kronan would have it no other way. For now, when he looked out of the viewports of his mighty stroke cruiser, as the R-starters called these ships, he could see a whirlwind of small, sharp and beefy-looking kill cruisers and escorts. Like a cloud of flies on a giant squig of stoppings, they clustered around his ship. There were hundreds of them there, and many more arriving every day. Yet Kronan knew that there was something missing. He could not quite put his finger on what, though. He had taken his world of birth. He was gathering a colossal number of his people in the one place. Yet he did not know if he had to go immediately, or to wait for more boys, cruisers and bosses to arrive. Because, being the cunning one, he was all too aware of how useless his own people could be when trying to read directions. If he set off too early, then anyone following was bound to be taken off course by the little distractions that often place themselves in the way of an orc. Undefended planets, agri-worlds, that sort of thing. And so it was that Kronan took to his quarters to consider the situation over a good night's sleep. Or so he thought. Now Kronan was indeed the cunning one, and he had wanted to remove all potential weakness from himself. He must become. So he decided to learn the arts of Void Waaagh. For he was no super soldier, genetically engineered, then allowed to claim a huge swathe of the planet and hailed as a prince, only to be defeated and forced to flee off into some self-imposed exile in space on a cryoship, to subsequently be found by a more advanced vessel, try to commandeer it to fail again, and then be exiled on another planet next to an orb that would explode, then be picked up by the same schmucks who found the first ship, take that one over, simply to be defeated again by his arch-nemesis, purely because he could not grasp three-dimensional warfare. And so it was that Kronan had asked Isaac Newton to set up a visual assistance in this regard. Hence, when Kronan went to his chambers to rest, his doorway opened wide into what would seem to be a huge tent. For, as discussed previously, Kronan found the Hume dwellings deeply un-orky. Hence, he had his home made to look like a tent of his people. Hanging from the ceiling of his tent were many, many grots. Each had differing lines of rope keeping them aloft as they rose and descended and swept slowly around the room. Now each of the grots had been given a makeover, so they appeared to be cruisers or escorts, with metal cones stapled onto their noses and armour attached to their sides with pins. They floated about above him, so Kronan could watch how they moved, how they ascended and descended, and how, when one was near another, they could attack each other. Now starships will be using shooters and docker of a dizzyingly myriad forms, but the grots were able to use their short-range burners to mimic the situation quite nicely. Hence the little things would flail and gnash as they got near one another, and then attempt to burn them. But due to the way it had been set up so cunningly by Isaac, very few of them were actually able to get within range. So they would sweep near and then be dragged away into a further part of their circuit, only to have the grot there scream with chagrin at being robbed of its rightful kill. Hence, even while learning, Kronan found it very conducive to his most terrible state of being, that of sinking. The screaming, the shouting, the grots floating above him. Kronan would often just lie on his back and watch them, and then go off into a perfectly restful deep slumber. Tonight was no different to normal, or at least, before he did indeed enter the land of Nod, the world of dreams. And it was an odd dream indeed, for Kronan was quite sure he was being spoken to by another force, an entity. For it was not often that his flater spoke to him. In fact, his bottom burps had never coalesced into a face either. But this night it was thus. For as he snoozed, he was laying down beneath his combating grots in their cruiser attire. His mind went blank for a change, when he anally exhaled most prodigiously and copiously. Truth be told, if he were awake, he would worry about it becoming a full-on follow-through. Yet this time, his fetus had colour, green of course, and it did not diffuse on the winds of the grots. It shimmered with a glow and formed into a face, a large green and particularly toothy grin. KRONAN looked at it nonchalantly, as one does in dreams, as it began to waffle through a deep-throated tract of some form of premonition. And thus it spake unto KRONAN. Drach'nyen, the first Choppa. It should be yours, KRONAN. The origins of Drach'nyen are a mystery, unknown perhaps even to Orks. Well, definitely actually. Demons will speak of the blade in fear, calling it the thorn in the rectum, or that bastard blade. They don't yet, but they will, I assure you. It is a weapon that existed long before the rise of humankind, and doubtless will bear witness to its end. With any luck. Well, more like effort. With enough effort, it would see the end of humankind, thought KRONAN. Alive with a dark cunning, Drach'nyen has the power to sunder the material universe with its cuttiness, hacking through matter as a mundane chopper moves through smoke. Which seemed a bit wordy for a statement like, "It's sharp," mused KRONAN. Even the hardest codpieces of demons, or armour sealed with the power of the warp, is little proof against its assaults, as it drinks the energy of the Waaagh like water, magnifying it. Which really was so overstated that KRONAN was beginning to lose his rag, even while in his dream. The fart apparition went on and on about Drach'nyen taking many forms, or something like that, and it all sounded so poxy that KRONAN zoned out utterly and thought about crumping instead. Yet, his ears perked up again at the most important part, the buttons on the inner guard that made it to all manner of magnificently brutal and unexpectedly cunning things. And KRONAN knew that if he gained this Drach'nyen, he would not only be holding a magnificent chopper of wonder and worth, not only that it would be an icon by which he could draw even more of Orkidom to his banners, but like a particularly potent strain of military-grade catnip to a felinoid formation, the swag or drip that KRONAN would acquire would indeed be worthy of the excursion, but also that this might be the most blatant get-out-of-jail-free MacGuffin-y of all MacGuffins that ever a protagonist could hold. And yet, it would be a gift from his benefactor, his mentor, Mork, his god. And should KRONAN possess such a weapon, he knew that all others would know what he now knew. That he, KRONAN, the most cunning yet orky of all orcs, well, apart from maybe Gazgul Magorek Thraka, but let's leave him out of this one, would hold a very sigil of his right, his might, his splendorous destiny. He would now be on a mission from God, and none could refute it. If only he could gain this Drach'nyen. And so it was that KRONAN woke with this name rumbling around in his bonds. He recalled every nuance of the dream and related it to Mad Nut Krunkelstein, who he summoned immediately upon waking from this madness. The weird boy looked on in wonder at KRONAN as he related the events he had witnessed. Now Mad Nut's first sally was to ask KRONAN if he had eaten a rancid or rotten squig before reclining, or perhaps indulged in some way past its sell-by-date hummy meat, or if he thought that perhaps KRONAN had taken on too much and insinuated that more delegation could indeed spread the load. But when KRONAN's pet Tiddles let some drool from his mighty and very gnashy jaw trickle over the shoulder of the cross-legged head weird boy, Mad Nut soon changed tack and nodded his agreement that this was indeed a potent vision from their god, Mork. When pushed for a resolution, Madnut sat there transfixed with confusion. Well, he did, until KRONAN gave him a helpful buffet across the cheek and delicately pointed out that the scum Toba had called upon his gods to send him across Aquilonia only months before. And surely anything that Turd and his whiffy weakling Hubie gods could do, then surely the mighty Mork could do at least thrice as well, minimum. Collecting the teeth that had been helpfully dislodged from his gob, Madnut did indeed nod and state that it was true. Anything that Hubie gods could do, Mork could do better. I mean, like literally anything. And so it was that the day was filled with many a shouted order from Madnut Krunkelstein, as he gathered as many of his fellow weird boys in one place as he could feasibly do, without their heads all popping like a piñata hit by a bane blade. And it always amazed KRONAN how his visions permitted the impossible to happen so effortlessly. It was almost as if the greenskins were a walking cornucopia of unrealized power that merely required him to point out the potentials before they could be almost instantaneously realized. Like they were carrying around on a genetic level. Not that he would have put it that way, of course, because so few use the word cornucopia these days. Must be the lack of a classical education, but then, who could care when you could find nearly any information by just using a data slate? But I digress. And so it was that within only 2 days, the plan was reaching fruition. KRONAN strode to the hangar bay and was immediately accosted with the most strange of sights. So strange was it that he was not entirely certain he was still awake. Or he was, until his rebellious left arm crept into his butt crack again. And it never did that in his dreams. Hence, KRONAN knew he was awake. Yet his mind boggled at what transpired before his vision. For as he entered the hangar, he was accosted with the most whiffy of pongs, as Madnut had filled the entire area with pungent and yucky-smelling incense. Well, to call it incense was a stretch. For some reason, Madnut had gotten into the habit of using giant squigoth pats for his fires. He stated it lent to an otherworldly ambiance, but most believed it was because his main grot attendants did not like him much. But after the grog-induced dance of the grots that Madnut had subjected to their camp, it was no surprise. For one entire night he had got completely pissed, and then invoked green smashing stamping feet of Gork and Mork across their entire compound. The carnage had been horrific, but then they were only grots, and the numbers came up again in no time. Many of the fleets or flotillas seemed to bring their own grots, which was always handy. Alas, the grots did not see the funny side of the event. Go figure. And so it was that KRONAN strode into the bay, trying his best to not breathe through his nose, and he was assailed by a vision of true power. KRONAN had decided that this would be a quest of unprecedented personal achievement, or a total failure that would make him look less skilled or useful than an iceberg lettuce. Hence, in either case, he did not want a gaggle of fauners there to get in his way. It was to be a small, crack elite group. It would be he, Tiddles, Grinner and Madnut only, who would go on this awesome quest. Now, Gitsgusher McMurder had not been overly thrilled to be separated from his war boss, or involved in this epic quest, nor Dacre von Smashhoven, and Hypocrates insisted that Happy Len at least attend as well, just in case emergency medical assistance would be required. KRONAN ignored most of them, yet knew that Tiddles would definitely like his own pet, Len, to be along for the ride, and acquiesce to this one point alone. But he informed Dacre von Smashhoven that he would be required to stay and make everyone toe the line. And when he pointed out to Gitsgusher McMurder that he also would be needed to run the welcome wagon and the first contact protocols, both were sated. Not that it made a heck of a lot of difference, thought KRONAN, as he would just lop off their heads if they disagreed. Yet his time and revelations in the events that ran up to, and included, the Squig Games, did moderate some of his behaviour these days. Oh, he was unspeakably brutal and violent as always, but he did restrain himself and offered just a modicum of consideration to his main bosses. All bar Grinner, of course. As that rapscallion was not to be trusted, KRONAN would take him along for the ride. Thus Madnut screamed a final dragged-out bellow, and the ritual came to its conclusion. The power of the Weird Boys was crystallized by the roar from the Psycho Ork, and before them it rent a hole in space and time. KRONAN, Madnut, Grinner and Tiddles, and his pet, Happy Len, all looked at the green wobbling tear in reality, and then stepped inside. And they were launched across the galaxy to the one place they could possibly find Drach'nyen, the first Choppa. A place called Armageddon, which was once called Alanor. The very birthplace of the Orks. To be continued.